January 17, 1944. Berchtesgaden, Bavaria. The alpine wind cuts sharp across the stone terrace. Inside the Berghof, smoke curls from expensive cigars. Senior Wehrmacht officers lean over oak tables, scattered with intelligence photographs, grainy images of harbor installations, crude wooden structures floating in English coastal waters. One officer, General Major Wilhelm Richter, commander of the 716th Static Infantry Division tasked with defending the Normandy coast, taps a photograph with his gloved finger and laughs. The sound echoes against the vaulted ceiling. Schwimmen docks, he says, the words dripping with contempt. Floating docks, toys. The other officers join the laughter. How could the Americans and British possibly believe that temporary harbors, artificial piers made of concrete and steel, towed across the most treacherous stretch of water in Europe, could sustain an invasion? The very idea violated every principle of military logistics they had learned at Kriegssee. Ports took decades to build, centuries to perfect. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais were fortresses of stone and steel, defended by coastal artillery and hardened bunkers. The Allies would need months to capture even one, and in those months, the panzers would drive them back into the sea. But before we journey further into this moment of fatal miscalculation, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss the stories of courage, innovation, and the pivotal moments that shaped our world. These tales deserve to be remembered, and your support ensures they live on. The laughter in that Bavarian hall was not merely arrogance. It was the product of a worldview, a military philosophy built on European precedent. For centuries, amphibious invasions had succeeded or failed based on a single factor: ports. Without them, armies starved. William the Conqueror had relied on existing harbors. Napoleon's planned invasion of England had obsessed over port seizure. Even the Germans' own Operation Sea Lion, the aborted invasion of Britain in 1940, had identified port control as the precondition for success. The idea that an invading force could bypass ports entirely, that they could bring their own harbors with them, seemed to defy not just military logic, but the laws of nature itself. The English Channel was no Mediterranean pond. Winter storms could generate waves 30 feet high. Tides rose and fell 20 feet twice daily. Winds howled at gale force for weeks. And the Americans, these industrial upstarts who had spent most of their history avoiding European wars, thought they could build temporary harbors capable of handling the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The German General Staff had studied the Dieppe raid of August 1942. They had watched the Allies attempt a frontal assault on a fortified port and seen it end in catastrophe of the 6,000 men who landed. Nearly 4,000 were killed, wounded, or captured within 9 hours. The beaches ran red. The panzers barely needed to engage. The raid had confirmed what German military doctrine already knew: without port facilities, large-scale amphibious operations were suicide. So the Wehrmacht fortified every major port from Norway to Spain. They poured concrete, positioned 88mm guns, laid millions of mines, and waited. Let the Allies come. Let them throw themselves against stone and steel. The ports would be their graves. But in England, in the winter of 1943, something unprecedented was taking shape. Along the southern coast, in shipyards and construction basins from Southampton to the Thames estuary, engineers were building harbors. Not repairing them, not expanding them, building them from scratch, to be towed across open ocean. The project bore the innocuous codename Mulberry, named after the tree, chosen at random from a list to confuse German intelligence. 2 complete artificial harbors, each the size of Dover, designed to be assembled off the invasion beaches within days of the initial landings. The scope defied comprehension. Each Mulberry would require hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete and steel. Floating breakwaters called Bombardon's massive cruciform steel structures, 200 feet long, designed to absorb wave energy. Phoenix caissons, enormous concrete boxers, some 6 stories tall, to be sunk in precise formations creating harbor walls. Whale piers, flexible roadways that could rise and fall with the 20-foot tides, each supported by massive steel legs. And connecting it all, miles of floating bridge sections, strong enough to support Churchill tanks, supply trucks, and the endless stream of materials needed to sustain armies fighting inland. The mastermind behind this audacious scheme was not a military man, but a former Royal Navy officer turned civil servant, Commodore John Hood. He had been at Dieppe, he had seen the slaughter, and he had reached a radical conclusion. The Allies could never capture a fortified port intact. The Germans would destroy it before surrendering. As they had demolished Marseille's harbor facilities, as they would later demolish Cherbourg's. But what if ports weren't necessary? What if invasion forces could bring their own? He presented the concept to Churchill in May 1942. The Prime Minister, who had spent the First World War grappling with amphibious disasters at Gallipoli, immediately grasped the potential. He scrawled in the margins of the proposal, "Piers, for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves." By January 1944, those difficulties had indeed argued. and been overcome. In the Thames estuary, Phoenix caissons were being constructed in specially built dry docks. Each caisson required 15,000 tons of concrete reinforced with steel. They came in multiple sizes. The largest, codenamed Phoenix A1, measured 200 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 60 feet tall. Once complete, they would be floated out and sunk in predetermined positions off the Norman coast, creating an instant breakwater 2 miles long. Meanwhile, in Scottish lochs and English rivers, Bombardon units were being welded together steel floats connected by scaffolding, designed to roll with the waves rather than resist them, dissipating energy that would otherwise pound landing craft to splinters. And in workshops across southern England, fabricators were constructing whale pier sections HX segment 80 feet long, with telescoping steel legs that would rest on the seafloor while the roadway floated, adjusting automatically to tidal changes. The scale of construction required was industrial, on a level that only American and British manufacturing could sustain. At peak production, 20,000 workers were engaged in Mulberry construction. Steel allocation for the project exceeded that of entire bomber production runs. Concrete consumption rivaled the Hoover Dam, and all of it had to be completed, tested, positioned, and towed into place within a 6-month window before the invasion. It was, in the words of one engineer, building 2 complete cities designed to float, then dragging them across 100 miles of hostile ocean, all while the enemy tries to bomb them into scrap. German reconnaissance flights occasionally spotted unusual construction along the English coast, but Luftwaffe intelligence analysts dismissed the structures as offshore anti-aircraft positions or experimental submarine barriers. The notion that they were components of mobile harbors never seriously entered Wehrmacht threat assessments. Why would it? The concept had no precedent, no historical parallel. It was too radical, too ambitious, too American. And that was the fatal flaw in German strategic thinking. They assessed Allied capabilities through a European lens. They assumed their enemies would fight a European war, constrained by European limitations. But the United States was not a European power. It was an industrial colossus that had spent the previous century mastering mass production, standardization, and logistical innovation on a continental scale. America had built transcontinental railroads through mountain ranges that European engineers declared impassable. It had electrified a nation larger than Western Europe in 2 decades. It had turned automobile production into an assembly line science, then applied that same science to building, producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The idea that such a nation would be constrained by the lack of stone harbors was a failure of imagination. By late May 1944, the components were ready. More than 400 separate structures, collectively weighing over 1.5 million tons. The towing operation alone required 132 tugboats, with crews trained in specialized deep-sea hauling techniques. Secrecy remained absolute. Even most Allied soldiers, loading onto transports for D-Day, had no idea that artificial harbors would follow them across the channel. The German 716th Infantry Division, still dug into bunkers along the Norman coast, continued to train for the expected Allied assault on Calais or Cherbourg, confident that without a major port, any landing elsewhere would wither and die. June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks gray over Normandy. The horizon fills with ships, more ships than any human has ever seen in one place. A steel forest stretching to the limits of vision. The German defenders, those who survived the initial bombardment, stare in disbelief. Thousands of vessels, tens of in disbelief. Thousands of vessels, thousands of men, but no port within 50 miles. How long can they sustain this? Days, perhaps, a week. Then the supply lines will collapse. The panzers will counterattack. The sea will swallow them. On June 7th, the first Mulberry components arrive. Phoenix caissons, riding low in the water, towed by sweating tugboat crews who have navigated through minefields and around wrecked landing craft. Engineers aboard small launches survey the seafloor, marking positions with buoys. On June 9th, the first caisson is scuttled. Valves open. Seawater floods interior chambers. The massive concrete box settles onto the sandy bottom with a muffled thud felt through the soles of boots on nearby ships. Then the next, and the next. By June 12th, a breakwater begins to take shape, a line of concrete monoliths rising from the sea, each positioned with geometric precision, creating calm water in their lee even as waves batter their seaward faces. German officers watching through field glasses from the cliffs above cannot comprehend what they are seeing. At first, they report sunken block ships, a known tactic for creating temporary shelter. But block ships don't arrive in formations. They don't interlock. They don't extend for miles in mathematically precise arcs. Reconnaissance aircraft are dispatched. Photographs return to headquarters. Kriegsmarine analysts spread them across tables in concrete bunkers and feel the first cold touch of understanding. The Allies are not waiting to capture a port. They are building one, in open water, under fire. In a matter of days, on June 14, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Fa, commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, writes in his diary, one of the last entries before he is killed in combat, "The enemy has brought harbor walls with them. Our entire defensive strategy has been based on a false premise. We cannot stop what we did not imagine was possible." By June 18, both Mulberry harbors are operational. Mulberry A, off Omaha Beach, designated for American forces. Mulberry B off Gold Beach, for the British and Canadians. Each harbor now encompasses an area of approximately 2 square miles of calm water. Whale piers extend from the breakwaters to the beaches, their flexible roadways undulating gently with the tide. LSTS landing ship. Tanks maneuver into position alongside the piers, drop their ramps, and disgorge Sherman tanks that roll directly onto the floating roadways and drive to shore without getting their treads wet. Liberty ships anchor in the protected harbors and unload supplies onto waiting DUKW's amphibious trucks that ferry cargo to distribution points inland. The flow of materiel is staggering. Within the first week of full operation, the Mulberries are handling more cargo per day than the port of Southampton handled before the war. German gunners shell the harbors from inland positions, but the damage is negligible. The Phoenix caissons absorb hits that would cripple stone piers. Their reinforced concrete is 2 feet thick. Even direct strikes from 88mm guns only chip the surfaces, and when damaged sections of floating pier need replacement, cranes simply lift them away and drop in prefabricated substitutes. The harbors are modular, repairable, expandable. Everything the Germans' static defenses are not. On June 19, disaster strikes, but not from German action. A storm rolls in from the Atlantic, the worst June gale in 40 years. Winds exceed force 6. Waves build to heights that would challenge any harbor in Europe. For 3 days, the storm batters the Normandy coast. Mulberry A, the American harbor, suffers catastrophic damage. Bombardon breakwaters tear loose from their anchors. Phoenix caissons shift position. Whale pier sections buckle and collapse. By June 22, when the storm finally abates, Mulberry A is wrecked beyond repair. 800 craft have been driven ashore or sunk. The Americans abandon it, salvaging components to reinforce Mulberry B. But here is what the storm reveals: a truth more devastating to German hopes than any military victory. Mulberry B survives. Battered, damaged, but functional. Within 48 hours of the storm's end, cargo operations resume. The British harbor continues to operate through July, through August, into September. By the time Cherbourg's port facilities are finally captured and repaired, a process that takes 2 months and requires clearing thousands of mines and removing hundreds of tons of deliberate demolitions, Mulberry B has already landed 500,000 tons of supplies, 40,000 vehicles, and over 200,000 troops. The German officers who had laughed in the Berghof are no longer laughing. General Major Richter, whose 716th Division was obliterated in the first days of fighting, is a prisoner. Those officers still at liberty study intelligence reports with growing dread. The Americans have done more than build artificial harbors. They have demonstrated a form of warfare that renders traditional defensive thinking obsolete. If an enemy can bring its own infrastructure, can create logistics networks from nothing, can replace losses faster than you can inflict them, then what defense is possible? How do you stop an army that treats the impossible as merely difficult? In Wehrmacht field headquarters, DAF officers pore over captured documents and interrogation reports, trying to understand the industrial processes that made Mulberry possible. The numbers they uncover beggar belief. The United States is producing 1 merchant ship per day, 1 bomber per hour. By 1944, American factories are manufacturing more war materiel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The Soviet Union is outputting tanks at a ratio of 4-to-1 against German production, and Britain, supposedly crippled by years of bombardment, has contributed half the components of Mulberry, including most of the engineering innovations. But the officers analyzing these reports missed the deeper lesson, or perhaps cannot afford to acknowledge it. The Mulberry harbors are not merely a triumph of engineering. They are the physical embodiment of a different civilization's values. Democratic nations at war do not just mobilize armies, they mobilize entire populations in voluntary coordination. Engineers who spent their careers building bridges and dams apply those skills to floating roadways. Factory workers who assembled cars retool for Phoenix caisson production. Scientists who studied wave dynamics in university laboratories calculate optimal breakwater spacing. The project succeeds because it draws on decentralized expertise, on the accumulated knowledge of thousands of specialists working toward a common goal, coordinated not through coercion but through shared purpose. There is a symbolic object that recurs in American military operations, visible in photographs from every theater of war. The jerrycan, not the original German invention, but the American mass-produced version, stamped steel, 5-gallon capacity, handles designed for easy carrying by 1 man or 2. Simple, functional, endlessly By 1944, millions of them flow through Allied supply lines. They carry fuel, water, lubricants. They stack efficiently in cargo holds and transport planes. When empty, they are discarded or repurposed. Their abundance is a form of military power that cannot be measured in firepower alone. A German panzer division in Normandy might possess superior tanks, but when its panzers run dry because fuel trucks cannot navigate bombed roads, while American Shermans keep rolling because jerry cans are everywhere, the outcome is predetermined. The Mulberry harbors are jerry cans on a civilization scale, modular, mass-produced solutions to problems that traditional military thinking insists require custom solutions. Each Phoenix caisson is built to identical specifications, allowing them to be constructed simultaneously in multiple locations by different crews. Each whale pier section interfaces with every other through standardized connectors. This is not the German approach, where each Tiger tank is a hand-fitted masterpiece requiring specialized parts. This is American industrial democracy. Good enough, plenty of it. Delivered on time, by September 1944. As Allied armies race across France, the strategic impact of Mulberry becomes undeniable. The Germans have lost the war of logistics. They are retreating across a landscape their own scorched earth tactics have devastated, while Allied supply columns roll forward on roads maintained by engineering battalions, supplied through a network of depots that stretches back through Mulberry B, across the Channel, to the inexhaustible factories of Britain and America. In the Ardennes, that December, Germany will launch one final desperate offensive, throwing its last reserves into the Battle of the Bulge. It will fail, not because German soldiers lack courage or German generals lack skill, but because when American supply lines are cut, new ones are established within days. When fuel runs short, it arrives by air. When ammunition depletes, convoys deliver millions of rounds. The Americans fight with the confidence of men who know that every loss will be replaced, every shortage remedied, every setback temporary. The German soldiers fighting in those frozen forests have no such confidence. They advance with vehicles running on fumes, knowing that no fuel convoy is coming. They ration ammunition because no resupply exists. They fight magnificently and die uselessly, not because they lack will, but because their nation's industrial base has been bombed into rubble, and their logistics network stretches across a continent their enemies control. The Ardennes offensive collapses not in a single dramatic defeat, but in a slow suffocation, units immobilized for lack of fuel, artillery silent for lack of shells, wounded, left untreated for lack of medical supplies. That there is a photograph, taken in February 1945, that captures the essence of what Mulberry represents. It shows a long line of American trucks, bumper to bumper, stretching to the horizon on a French road. The trucks are identical GMC to Unterhoften cargo carriers, 6x6 drive, canvas-covered beds loaded with supplies. The line extends so far that the lead vehicles disappear into haze. This is the Red Ball Express, the Allied supply operation that ran 24 hours a day, delivering materiel from Mulberry B and later from Cherbourg to frontline units. At its peak, it involved 6,000 trucks moving 5,000 tons of supplies per day. The photograph is grainy, utilitarian, undramatic, but to a German logistician studying it in a prisoner of war camp, it is more terrifying than any image of bombers or battleships, because it shows not just abundance but abundance made routine, industrialized, reduced to bureaucratic procedure. The Mulberry harbors themselves, or what remains of them, sit quietly off the Norman coast after the war. Most components are scuttled or scrapped. A few Phoenix caissons remain visible at low tide, barnacle-encrusted concrete monoliths that French fishermen use as navigation markers. Whale pier sections are towed back to England and repurposed for civilian construction. The engineering specifications are filed away in military archives. The tugboat crews dispersed to merchant marine postings. The project, which consumed more resources than some nations' entire war efforts, fades into historical footnote status, overshadowed by more dramatic battles and famous generals. But in Soviet military academies after the war, Mulberry becomes a case study. Staff officers analyze the operation, not for its tactical details, but for what it reveals about capitalist industrial capacity. The Soviet Union has its own traditions of military innovation, its own examples of achieving victory through adaptation. But even Soviet generals acknowledged that the Mulberry concept required a breadth of civilian technical expertise and industrial coordination that command economies struggled to replicate. The project succeeded because it drew on shipbuilders, structural engineers, tidal specialists, materials, scientists, logistics experts, and dozens of other specializations, all coordinating voluntarily within a framework of shared strategic purpose. This is not a repudiation of centralized planning. The Mulberries required enormous government investment in military coordination, but a recognition that solving unprecedented problems demands drawing on decentralized expertise. There is an epilogue written in a different kind of text in the trade agreements and reconstruction plans that follow the war. The same engineers who designed floating harbors go on to design container shipping systems that revolutionize global commerce. The modular thinking that made Phoenix caissons interchangeable influences post-war prefabricated housing construction. The mass production techniques refined for whale piers find application in bridge building across Europe's reconstructed infrastructure. The Mulberry harbors, built to fight a war, become a template for the peacetime economic order that follows standardized, modular, scalable systems designed for rapid deployment and easy replacement. In the 1960s, a British engineer named Alan Beckett, who had worked on Mulberry design, uses the same principles to create the roll and roll-off ferry systems that dominate modern shipping. The concept is identical. Floating piers that adjust to tides, allowing vehicles to drive directly on and off. Today, every car ferry in the world is a descendant of whale technology, carrying tourists where tanks once rolled. The larger truth that the German officers missed in January 1944 was not just about harbors. It was about the fundamental character of the societies they were fighting. Totalitarian systems excel at concentrating power, at directing resources toward singular objectives, at achieving spectacular results in narrow domains. But they struggle with adaptation, with integrating diverse expertise, with the kind of decentralized innovation that solves problems no one has seen before. Democratic nations at war are chaotic, argumentative, inefficient in countless ways, but they excel at precisely the kind of challenges that modern warfare demands. They create environments where a civilian engineer can tell a general that his logistics plan is impossible, and the general listens, where factory workers suggest improvements to military designs, and those improvements get implemented, where failure is analyzed rather than punished, allowing rapid iteration toward solutions. The Mulberry harbors were not inevitable. They required thousands of individual decisions by people at every level, from Churchill's initial approval to the tugboat captain, who held position during the storm, to the welder who reinforced a critical joint. Each of those decisions carried risk. Many failed, but the system as a whole possessed resilience, redundancy, and the capacity to learn from failure that made ultimate success achievable. Today, fragments of Phoenix caissons still sit off the Norman coast, visible at extreme low tides. French schoolchildren sometimes visit them on history expeditions, clambering over seaweed-covered concrete to peer into barnacle-filled chambers. Most have no idea what they are looking at, just old wartime wreckage, slowly being reclaimed by the sea. But, for those who know the story, those concrete blocks represent something more. They are monuments to human ingenuity in the service of freedom. They are the physical proof that when free people commit to a common purpose, when industrial capacity is mobilized democratically, when innovation is empowered rather than stifled, the so-called impossible becomes merely difficult. The German officers who laughed in January 1944 died defending their ideology, the belief that will and discipline and martial tradition could overcome material disadvantage. Some died heroically, many died pointlessly, but all died learning the lesson that the Mulberry harbors taught, that in modern war, industrial capacity is destiny, and industrial capacity flows from the character of a society itself. You cannot build artificial harbors through coercion alone. You cannot mass-produce innovation by command. You cannot sustain a war effort when your workforce is enslaved, and your experts are persecuted, and your industrial base operates on theft rather than productivity. In the end, Mulberry was not about floating docks. It was about what kind of civilization can conceive, design, build, and deploy floating docks while simultaneously fighting a two-front war, supplying allies on 3 continents, and maintaining civilian morale without resorting to totalitarian control. The answer to that question was written in concrete and steel on the beaches of Normandy. And the writing said, only a free people can do this. Only societies that value individual expertise, that protect innovation, that coordinate through consent rather than compulsion, can marshal the collective capability to drag harbors across the sea. The waves still pound those shores. The tides still rise and fall 20 feet twice daily. But the concrete endures, slowly dissolving into the sand. One molecule at a time, a fitting metaphor. The Mulberry harbors were temporary structures built to enable a permanent victory. They served their purpose and then were discarded. Their materials repurposed, their designs archived. They were never meant to last forever, but the principles they embodied: standardization, mass production, modular design, civilian-military cooperation, distributed expertise. Those principles became permanent features of the post-war order. They are the invisible infrastructure of the modern world, as fundamental and as unnoticed as the tide itself. And so the story ends where it began, with laughter in a mountain hall. But the laughter has changed. It belongs now to the engineers who proved the skeptics wrong, to the sailors who towed the impossible across hostile seas, to the soldiers who walked dry-shod onto enemy beaches across floating roads that history said could not exist. Their laughter is quiet, satisfied, tinged with loss, for friends who died but certain of the rightness of their cause. They built harbors in the storm. They carried democracy on their backs. And when the waves finally claimed their work, they left behind something more enduring than concrete, the knowledge that free people, working together, can accomplish what tyrants cannot even imagine.